I'm joined today by Chuck Collins, who's an author and also a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also co-founder of Wealth for Common Good. Chuck, we've been talking about income and wealth inequality in the United States. We know some of the incredible statistics, like, for example, that the richest 20 Americans own more wealth than the entire bottom half of the country. I want to talk to you about the economic and social impact of that. But before, give us a sort of summary of how we even got to such an incredible gap when it comes to wealth.
Well, I've been tracking this for almost 30 years. We basically have seen a gradual growing concentration of wealth at the top. I think there's no single cause. There's a number of reasons why that's happening. But I would argue that probably the single biggest driver is that various rules of the economy, tax policy, trade policy, et cetera, have benefited asset owners at the expense of wage earners. And so I think we're seeing assets expanding, wages being stagnant for almost 30 years. But it was really only 10 years ago that the median income was 85. The median wealth was like $85,000. It's gone down, and this concentration at the top just continues to defy gravity, really.
And when we think about, one element we've talked about is productivity for the average worker continues to increase. In other words, the average worker is producing, whether it be goods or services, more than ever before. But as you mentioned, their wage is not going up. And that, talk to us a little bit about that, right? I mean, the additional productivity that workers are creating is sort of being moved up in a redistribution of income, as some like to say, to those at the top of the income brackets and big corporations.
Yeah, so I would say a huge driver is, productivity's gone up, wages have stayed low. Most of that productivity gain, then the wealth and income gains from that have gone to not just really the top 1%, but what we're seeing really in the last 8 or 9 years is it's going to the top 1/10 of 1%, who've captured most of the income and wealth gains at the top. So that's clearly a driver. And, as the French economist Thomas Piketty has pointed out, if that's the machinery, if left without intervening in any way, where we're heading is we're seeing going to a kind of a concentrated wealth, a sort of a plutocracy, where wealth continues to concentrate, wealth and power continue to concentrate at the top. So we have to do something to intervene in that inequality cycle.
So people can have different opinions as to whether this is moral or ethical, what we see happening. But let's not have that conversation. Let's have the conversation as to what is the economic impact of such wealth inequality. And then whether it's moral or not becomes sort of irrelevant if we can make some general assessments as to whether this is a good or bad thing for the economy at large. So how can we think about that?
Well, one thing to think is that this concentration of wealth actually kind of creates a huge amount of distortions and volatility in the economy. So you have real wages staying flat or falling for most of the population. That means that the aggregate demand, the consumer buying demand of people at the bottom and the middle is really not as engaged. And then at the very top, you have this unreal concentration of assets, which leads to sort of some unreal risk taking, meaning people at the very top, I'm talking about, the top 1% of households, are starting to move and a portion of their wealth into more financially speculative investments, investments that get higher returns than the real economy, which isn't, returning a lot in terms of interest or earnings. So you have this twin dynamic. You have stagnant wages on the bottom, and then you have concentrated wealth at the top, looking more and more venturing into the sort of speculative arena of the marketplace. And all of that leads to certain volatility, huge volatility. So just take the energy market today, or over the last couple of months, or real estate in major urban areas. Those are all local and national and global economies that are being distorted by these great inequities of wealth. And as we also know, that it sort of undermines the traditional measures of growth. I mean, the International Monetary Fund is now showing at the global level how these inequalities actually undermine traditional measures of economic growth. So too much too much inequality is bad for the economy in a number of ways.
And what about the social impact? The economic analysis you've done is very clear. We've talked about it before. We've spoken to other economists about it. What about the sort of intangible social impact of such wealth inequality?
Well, I think what we know is that as societies become more unequal, there is a breakdown in solidarity where people no longer feel that they're in the same boat. And it actually increases sort of a sense of fear and polarization. I would argue, in some ways, our 2016 presidential election dynamics, where you have a Trump and a Sanders candidate, they're both emerging out of the same phenomena, which is this is what happens when middle classes collapse, when people feel like the economy is rigged against them. Whatever political analysis they take with that may send them in different directions, but the underlying problem is this polarization. So I think it leads to kind of a whole bunch of negative indicators. It's bad for health. It's bad for public health, even for very wealthy people. It's bad for social cohesion. It undermines sort of neighborhoods when and communities when there are these volatile and destructive inequities. So I think it sort of pulls at our culture. It moves us in the wrong direction in terms of us as a society.
There's certain issues we talk about where there are very clear sort of action items or asks that the average individual can do in terms of engaging lawmakers or engaging with the political system or society, et cetera. With this one, it's been more difficult for us on the program to figure out what individuals can do. I mean, certainly it would be great to elect more politicians who would put in policies that would have a sort of equalizing effect to reduce this drastic income gap that we have. But what can the average person really do?
Well, I think continuing to talk to their friends and neighbors about why these inequalities matter, believe it or not, is very important because I think as a society, we've gone from 10 years ago when we really didn't talk about it to a broader recognition and connect the dots. These inequalities really do affect the quality of life for all of us. Then I think there's a sort of three ways to think about the solutions. There's the things that raise the floor, like raising the minimum wage, creating a better sort of social safety net. That's what many, Canada and other European countries, the reason they have less inequality is they have a higher floor. There's also things that we can do to level the playing field. We shouldn't have one tax code for the wealthy and one for everyone else, one for global corporations and one for everyone else. We should have a level playing field in terms of those rules.
And
But I would say
isn't
we
there
have
a
to.
challenge there, though, in that those who have sort of set up the system the way it's set up have no real interest in allowing it to change, right? Those who benefit from that system would prevent it from changing to the extent that they're able.
Yeah, we're sort of in a little bit of a locked in position, which is the power of concentrated wealth has captured our, certainly at the national level, captured our electoral system. So it's very hard to talk about rule changes that would meaningfully reduce this inequality. But I think if you look at the undercurrent, think about the number of students that are holding debt. There's a political constituency. Look at polls that show that the public supports taxing incomes on millionaires. 75% of the public now supports those kind of policies. So there's a realignment happening at the base, which I think will lead to a political realignment eventually, not in the short term, because you have a Congress that's pretty much beholden to the donor class. Um, that's why I'm saying I think we also have to sort of put on the table policies that may not actually pass today, but we sort of build an understanding of why they're important, like taxing progressive inheritance taxes, taxing higher incomes at a certain level. There's a piece in the New York Times today that looks at the aggressive tax avoidance of people really in the top 1%. So we need to restore the progressivity of the tax system. That may not be wildly popular or politically feasible in the short term, but we got to keep beating that drum. Eventually, there will be a realignment. Either that or we become a kind of society we really don't want to be.
I'll tell everybody once again, we've been speaking with Chuck Collins. He's an author. He's a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and the co-founder of Wealth for Common Good. Chuck, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Thank you, David. Good chatting with you.